Curiosity had drawn Eli McGraw to the edge of town that morning, the kind of curiosity born not of interest, but of emptiness. The snow fell slow and heavy over the Montana plains, softening the outlines of a world that had grown too hard for him. The wind carried laughter from the trading post, the kind that stung because he'd forgotten how it felt. He hadn't planned on stepping inside. He just wanted to feel the heat of a stove, maybe a few words to remind him he still belonged somewhere. But the moment he crossed the threshold, his life began to change, though it would be weeks before he realized it. She stood near the back, arms bound, her face streaked with dust and pride. The trader, Silas Boone, was speaking loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Too wild for any decent household," he declared, his grin split wide as a butcher's knife. "Couldn't follow a rule if her life depended on it. You'd think she was born of coyotes instead of people." The men laughed. One offered a $50, just to see her flinch. She didn't. Her eyes met his instead, Eli's, and for one strange heartbeat he forgot the ache in his chest. There was something alive in that stare, something reckless and bright. Not madness. Not defiance. Just the quiet, unbreakable will of someone who had lived too long without kindness. Eli couldn't look away. "How much?" he asked before he even knew he'd spoken. The laughter stopped. Boone turned, surprised, then smirked. "You want her? Ain't many would take on trouble like that." Eli said nothing more, just placed his last pouch of coins on the table. Boone counted, shrugged, and waved him off. "She's yours, then. Don't say I didn't warn you." She didn't thank him. She didn't look relieved. She simply followed when he gestured toward the door, the sound of her boots against the wooden floor sharp and certain. Outside, the cold bit at their faces. She kept her chin high as if daring the snow to fall harder. He offered her his coat. She refused. The walk back to his ranch stretched long, marked only by the wind and the soft crunch of ice underfoot. He tried once to speak, to ask her name, but she cut him off with a look that told him she had nothing left to give, not even words. By the time they reached his land, twilight had settled, turning the world a shade between blue and silver. His ranch looked smaller than he remembered, half swallowed by drifts and silence. The barn stood crooked, the house cold. He pointed to the door. "You can sleep inside." She glanced toward the barn instead. "I'll take the hay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Suit yourself?" He didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that you can't pull someone into warmth until they're ready to leave the cold. That night, he watched from the window as she built a small nest of blankets in the corner of the barn. The lantern light touched her face in gold, revealing eyes that softened only when she reached out to touch the horse's muzzle. She whispered something to it, a string of words too faint to hear. It made him wonder who she'd been before this life had branded her untamable. Somewhere deep inside him, something stirred, an ache as old as loneliness. Morning came clear and sharp. She was already awake, brushing down the mare before the frost had even melted from the fence posts. He brought her bread and coffee without speaking. She nodded once, accepting both like small truce offerings. He noticed her hands, chapped, strong, the kind of hands that knew work but had been denied it. Later that day, she repaired a section of broken fence without being asked. By dusk, she'd fixed 2 more. He didn't thank her either. Some things between them didn't need words. The town, however, was less silent. By week's end, the gossip had spread faster than wildfire on dry brush. Mrs. Hattie Long, the innkeeper, told Eli gently, "They say you bought yourself a wife, or worse. Don't mind them, but do be careful. The wild don't always settle easy." He nodded, though the words sat heavy. When he returned home, he found Clara. He'd learned her name that morning, sitting by the fire she'd built in the barn, her face streaked with ash and light. He hesitated before stepping closer. "They talk," he said simply. She didn't look up. "They always do." It was then he saw it, the smallest tremor in her hands as she fed the fire another log. Fear not of him, but of being seen. She was trying to stay invisible, to remain something the world couldn't claim or cage. He understood that too well. So he sat beside her in silence, sharing warmth without demand. When he stood to leave, he placed a wool blanket by her side. She didn't thank him, but her hand brushed the fabric as if memorizing the texture. That was enough. Days bled into one another. They built a rhythm out of quiet labor. He fixed fences, she gathered wood. He caught her once smiling at the sunrise, the faintest curve of lips as the first light touched her face. It startled him more than a gunshot. Later that evening, she brought in his gloves, mended neatly, without being asked. Thought they might last a little longer now, she said. He wanted to tell her that she'd done more than that she'd reminded him how kindness could feel. But he only nodded. Words seemed too fragile for moments like this. Winter deepened. The snow thickened until sound itself seemed muffled. One night, the roof groaned under its weight. He stepped outside, lantern in hand, checking the beams. She followed without being told, holding another lantern, its light brushing her face like fire caught in glass. You should be inside, he said. You shouldn't be out here alone, she replied. The way she said it wasn't defiant this time, it was human. For the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't looking past him. She was looking at him. Something shifted in the air between them, something as fragile as thawing ice. That night, when they returned to the barn, he poured her a cup of coffee and handed it over without a word. Her fingers brushed his. Just for a second, but long enough to leave warmth that lingered. She looked down at the cup and said, almost to herself, They called me wild because I wouldn't break. He answered softly, Maybe wild's just another word for alive. She didn't reply, but when she looked up, the guardedness in her eyes had faded to something quieter, something that looked almost like peace. In the days that followed, the silence between them grew gentler, easier. He began to listen for her footsteps, to mark time by the sound of her voice when she spoke to the horses. One dawn, he woke to find her standing outside, her hair tangled with snowflakes, her face turned to the rising sun. It's beautiful, she whispered, as if the land itself had forgiven her for existing. He watched her for a long moment, the light catching her hair like wildfire. It is, he said finally, though he wasn't sure he meant the view. And somewhere in that quiet morning, something like hope began to take root, not loud or certain, but steady as the thaw that comes after the longest winter. He didn't know what spring would bring, or if it would bring anything at all. But for the first time in years he wanted to find out. The blizzard came without warning, a wall of white swallowing the horizon. By midday, Eli could barely see the barn from the porch. The wind howled like something ancient and hungry, rattling the shutters, prying at the seams of the house as if it meant to take it apart. Inside, the fire struggled to live, and so did they. Clara fed it with careful precision, adding logs one at a time, her face lit in amber and shadow. It's going to last all night, she murmured. Eli nodded, wrapping his hands around a cup of bitter coffee gone cold. He'd lived through harsh winters before, but this one felt different, more personal, as though the storm itself meant to test whatever fragile peace they'd built. Outside, the cattle were penned tight, bracing against the wind. He needed to check them, but the thought of leaving her alone in that weather twisted at him. Stay inside, he said, reaching for his coat. She didn't argue, only watched him with a stillness that made him pause. You shouldn't go out there, she said softly. The storm's not what it looks like, it's meaner underneath. Her voice held something he'd never heard before, not fear, but knowing. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. So am I. When he stepped outside, the wind swallowed him whole. By the time he returned, his eyelashes were crusted in ice, and blood trickled from a gash on his forehead where a falling branch had caught him. She pulled him inside, half dragging him toward the fire. You're freezing, she whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed a damp cloth to his wound. He didn't protest, didn't move. The warmth of her hands was more grounding than anything he'd felt in years. It's just a scratch, he said. You shouldn't worry. She shook her head, eyes glinting with frustration. You always say that, like nothing matters. But it does. You do. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she looked away, embarrassed by her own tenderness. Eli didn't speak. He just let the silence between them fill with something either could name. For 3 days, the storm didn't stop. The ranch vanished beneath drifts so deep they could have buried an entire season's worth of hope. They rationed what little food they had, beans, dried meat, and silence. At night, the wind sang through the cracks, low and mournful. She slept in the chair near the fire, refusing the bed. When she stirred in the dark, he sometimes caught the sound of her whispering, a prayer or maybe a memory. On the 4th morning, when the world outside had turned a dull, endless gray, they heard hooves crunching through snow. Eli opened the door to find Silas Boone, wrapped in furs, eyes mean as frostbite. "Heard you kept yourself a wild thing," he said, his voice slick with amusement. "I've come to take her back." Clara froze where she stood, her face draining of color. Eli stepped forward, shoulders squared, though his body ached from the cold. "She's not yours," he said evenly. Boone's smirk widened. "Everything's got a price, McGraw. You paid for her once, I figure you can pay again, or I'll take what's mine." The word burned the air. Clara's voice came from behind Eli, steady but shaking. "You can't own me. Not anymore." Boone's laughter was sharp, ugly. "You think this man's going to protect you? He can barely protect himself." He took a step closer, hand resting on his revolver. Eli didn't move. "You should leave," he said, calm as the eye of the storm. Boone sneered. "Or what?" The moment hung like a drawn breath. Then Clara spoke again, her voice quiet but carrying like wind through pines. "He doesn't have to hurt you. I already stopped running." The defiance in her tones startled even Eli. Boone lunged forward, shoving Eli aside. The two men crashed against the wall, the lantern tipped, flame licking the wood before Eli stomped it out. Boone's fist caught Eli's jaw, splitting skin. Clara reached for the iron poker, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. When Boone turned toward her, she swung. The sound echoed, iron against bone, a hollow, final crack. Boone fell, cursing through blood, then staggered to his feet and fled into the storm. The door slammed behind him, leaving nothing but the wild rush of wind and Clara's ragged breathing. Eli leaned against the wall, chest heaving. She dropped the poker, her hands shaking as if the weight of what she'd done was only now sinking in. "I didn't mean to," she began, but he stopped her with a look that held no judgment. "You did what you had to." His voice was soft, not proud, not fearful, just real. She sank to the floor beside him, the firelight trembling across their faces. "No one ever fought for me before," she whispered. "So I did it myself." He reached for her hand, rough palm brushing her knuckles. "Then you're stronger than anyone I know." Outside, the storm began to fade. The world exhaled quiet at last. In the morning, the snow was pale gold under the rising sun. They stood side by side, watching steam rise from the thawing earth. For the first time, the land looked alive again. The fences would need mending, the barn roof sagged under ice. But none of it felt hopeless. Clara stepped forward, sunlight warming her hair. "It's strange," she said. "When I first came here, I thought I'd been bought. Turns out I was found." Eli's throat tightened. "You were never lost," he said, though he knew he was lying. They both had been, until now. Weeks passed, and the thaw deepened. The streams began to run again, filling the air with the sound of moving water, a promise that winter couldn't keep them forever. Clara took to riding in the mornings, her laughter scattering the crows from the fence posts. Eli watched her from a distance, knowing better than to interrupt something that sacred. When she dismounted, he'd meet her with a quiet smile and coffee. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But every silence now carried meaning, not absence. When they finally rode together, the wind tore through their hair, cold and clean, smelling of pine and spring mud. The horses kicked up slush and light, and for a moment it felt as though the whole world had forgotten its bitterness. She turned to him, her eyes bright. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "About wild not meaning broken." He laughed, a sound that startled them both. You taught me that, he replied. By the time the grass returned, so did color, to the land, to their faces, to the story itself. The ranch, though still humble, began to breathe again. Word in town softened. Mrs. Long's gossip turned to fond rumor. That girl tamed him, people said. Or maybe he tamed her. But neither had tamed anything. They had only learned how to walk beside one another, how to carry silence without letting it turn to loneliness. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted everything in honeyed gold, Clara stood at the gate, her hand resting lightly on the wood. When I met you, she said, I thought the world had ended. But maybe it was just beginning. He looked at her, the warmth of the dying light touching her face, and answered, Maybe it was both. The wind rose again, softer this time, like a whisper carrying through the grass. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the last patches of snow melted into the earth. Eli reached for her hand, not to claim, but to keep pace. And as they stood there, side by side, the frontier stretched endless before them, a wild, beautiful thing, no longer something to conquer, but to share.